Matt Wolf, welcome to Bullseye. I'm so happy to have you on the show, and thank you for this film.
Thank you for having me.
How did you get into this project, making a film about Paul Reubens?
Well, as documentary filmmakers, we're always asked who would be your dream subject. And my answer was always Paul Reubens. I always wanted to make a film about Paul, but I knew, frankly, very little about him. But I came of age with Pee-wee Herman. I think intuitively sensed that the impact of that show was sort of in my DNA. It really gave me permission to be an artist or to be different. And, I, for various years, kind of pursued connecting with Paul unsuccessfully. But then there was a rumor in trade publications that the Safdie brothers were working with Paul on his, long rumored Dark Pee-wee movie, a script that Paul had written, I think decades earlier. And I knew Josh Safdie, so I reached out to him expressing that I've always wanted to make a documentary about Paul. And he said, well, we're not working with him. That's a rumor, but, let's see. And then, fortuitously, my producer, Emma Koskoff, was approached by Paul. He wanted to do a documentary and he was looking for advice. And she said, well, there's this rumor you're working with the Safdies. Why don't you go to them? And those guys sort of match made Paul and I. And this was during the lockdown of the pandemic. And we kind of had an initial Zoom in which Paul said what he says basically at the beginning of the film. I want to direct a documentary myself, but everyone's advising me against that, and I don't understand why. And I said, well, I'm here to talk to you about me directing a film. Why don't we get to know each other and maybe conceive of an approach that might make sense for you? And that began a pretty epic process, both to convince Paul to be a documentary subject, but also a very involved process of making the film before he passed away.
People, when you have an interview show, often ask you, well, who's your dream guest? And I had the same relationship to Paul's work that you did. He was always my dream guest. And maybe like 12 years ago, something like that, my producer, Julia, said, you're not going to believe this, but we got Paul Reubens. He was in a hotel room. He was on the road. So we did what we call double ender. That's where in radio you send a recordist to someone, you talk to them on the phone, but they have a microphone pointed at them so that you can have mic audio on both sides. And he wouldn't let the microphone guy point the mic at him. It made him uncomfortable. And I'm on the phone with Paul Reubens, like, hey, Paul, we kind of got to get the microphone pointed. He finally let us point the mic at him, but from like 4 or 5 feet away. So we were worried that the sound wouldn't even be good enough to run on the air, right? Our dream interview. When did you realize that was going to be part of the process of making this film? And I don't mean that he didn't want microphones close to him, but rather that he wanted to be the boss of himself.
I mean, I realized that within the first few minutes of speaking to him.
Did you realize the gravity of that? I mean, I think it would be normal for you to have a meeting with a documentary subject and to have them say, well, prove to me that I can trust you. When did you realize that this was more than that?
Immediately. I knew immediately that Paul's kind of needs or expectations or concerns as a documentary subject were unlike anything I had encountered before. And to some extent, I understood why. I mean, Paul's somebody who lost control of his personal narrative in the media, and a lot of his desire to make a documentary was, as he says in the film, to set the record straight, to tell the factual story of his life. But, I certainly could do that. I could help him do that. That's sort of the easy part. I think the deeper thing that he wanted but maybe wasn't able to articulate was to be seen as an artist and for people to appreciate in a deeper, more intellectual light all the inspirations and thinking that went behind his alter ego. But also, Paul's somebody who made a decision to just completely separate his self from his alter ego. And I think he felt, for whatever reason, that it was time to let people see his authentic self. And I think that was the scary part. But I wanted to help translate for Paul. I wanted to advocate for Paul and support him. But that didn't mean I wasn't a threatening presence. And that didn't mean that there wasn't a power struggle between us, because I'm also protective of my work, just as Paul was without a doubt protective of his life and his story, which he had never shared before. So I would say immediately it was clear that Paul's desire for control and also reservations about the documentary process were unprecedented for me and for other colleagues of mine that I've spoken to. And I knew I was in for an unconventional ride.
I think one of the most powerful moments in the movie for me, now this is an odd choice, I know, is there's a moment when the painter Wayne White, who worked as both an artist and as a puppeteer on Pee-wee's Playhouse, basically says it was a nightmare working on the show, and also that he thought it was great to work on the show. Like, he just says it without any, he's a very sort of sweet guy, but he says it with no vindictiveness or even anger. And that is something that is a hard thing to express or capture.
Well, I tried to follow Paul around in his day-to-day life, and it just didn't work. Being controlling, Paul wasn't able to just, let a camera follow him around. He wanted like a shot list of what we were going to film. It just didn't work. But when we finally sat down to do what would become, an epic interview over the course of 40 hours, on the first day, he just started to tease me and to rebel against the interview process, to procrastinate, making noises, making faces, jokes. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to go on literally forever. And then, halfway through the day, I thought, this is who Paul is. He's in real time enacting his resistance to the process of sharing himself. He's grappling with his own vulnerability, and he is a rebellious, mischievous guy. And so I started to think of this as interview verite, something I hadn't ever considered as a device before. And so throughout the film, there are these sort of interludes in which we show Paul and I interacting, and him really resisting my questions and reflecting on how strange our relationship is and what his relationship to control looks like. So I think in terms of trying to represent the difficulty or the complexity of the process of telling Paul's story, I tried to show in a more raw way what our conversational dynamic was. And sometimes it was dicey, but also thrilling, and deeply funny, but also super vulnerable. And that huge dynamic range of emotions, I think it comes across in the film, and I think it renders a complex portrait of Paul.
You came into this as one of the, millions of Americans between the ages of 35 and 55 for whom Pee-wee was like a life-changing force. What else did you know about Paul and his life besides Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Big Top Pee-wee, and Pee-wee's Playhouse?
I knew about his background in the Groundlings, that he had gone to Cal Arts. I personally was familiar with what kind of things were happening at Cal Arts during the kind of conceptual art, interdisciplinary arts heyday of the late 1970s. And I obviously knew about his arrest and the media controversies that surrounded him. But in terms of the constellations of inspirations that fueled Pee-wee, or the kind of sense of humor that was unique to Paul and separate from Pee-wee. I didn't know any of that. And in fact, when I first met Paul, there was a certain weirdness to feeling like, oh, I'm meeting somebody I don't know anything about. I'm not talking to Pee-wee, I'm talking to Paul Reubens, and he's not someone I know, and I don't know much about him. So, I wanted to get to know him and to understand how he works and what he thinks about as an artist. And it was a long process to get to know that, but a fascinating and like I said, thrilling journey.
Were you nervous to go in to a conversation that big with as little detail about him as he had revealed publicly to that point?
Well, there were hundreds of hours of conversations that happened before that interview. I mean, after that initial Zoom, we really started to Zoom regularly. It was during the lockdown. There was nothing else happening. And a lot of it was us feeling each other out, me being like, is it even workable to do this project together? But also, I think through that initial getting to know you period, we realized that we had a lot in common in terms of our interests and sensibilities as people. But also, Paul would have a lot of concerns that he would express. And I tried to give him as much information as I can about the documentary process. After a few months, he kind of begrudgingly agreed to proceed with the documentary on the condition that there would be a 30-day trial period to see if he felt comfortable working with me. I was like, really? We talked for dozens of hours. And the 30-day trial started and I couldn't get a hold of him. And I finally got a hold of Paul and I said, if I'm on a trial, we're talking 3 days a week. And with Paul, there was no 10 or 15-minute conversation. Every conversation was like 1.5 to 2 hours, like minimum. And we just started to talk, 6 to 10 hours a week. And we also made the decision to start recording those conversations just for reference, but also because we thought our relationship might be interesting. It might be something to look at. And so over the course of my 30-day trial, it really was sort of like an epic pre-interview. Paul and I would shoot the and kind of just talk about this or that. Me kind of assuage concerns or anxieties he was having about what a documentary would be and what the process is. But then he would go into the mode of kind of transmitting information to me that other people didn't know. And slowly but surely, he agreed to do an interview. And I showed up determined to do what I do with somebody who was very uncomfortable with the process, but also an incredibly dynamic storyteller who approached being interviewed like an overachiever. I've never experienced somebody so determined to relay as much detail in as engaging a way as possible. But there was a competitive dynamic. I mean, I said to Paul before the interview shoot, most people I interview in a long form way, 5 hours is sort of the limit. People start to get tired around then. He said, I'm not going to get tired. You're going to get tired. I said, well, actually, I'm not going to get tired. I could literally do it forever. He said, okay, we'll see. So it was not the normal interview process. Even though I showed up prepared, there were a lot of curveballs, but I think I was able to lead Paul in ways to make some connections that he may have not made himself before.
To what extent did you have his queerness in mind when you were preparing to talk to him or thinking about the film ahead of time?
It was important for me to discuss it, and Paul had made a commitment to himself and I guess to me to come out. That was something he wanted to do. And I wanted to help him do that. I'm gay, and a lot of queer people really, really connect to Pee-wee's Playhouse. But even more so than Paul's arrest, I think his biggest anxiety was coming out, and even more so a concern that I might focus too much on his sexuality. There was an interesting intergenerational dynamic between us, me being a gay person who's 42 and came out in my teen years in the late 90s, and him being in his late 60s at the time, growing up in the 50s. He didn't want to be defined by his sexuality, and I think many people assumed or knew that he was gay, but he had never come out publicly. And, the most intense and powerful day of the interviewing was when Paul came out. And in a way, he was sort of beating around the bush and kind of squirming as I was asking him questions related to his sexuality. And then, the way I filmed this interview is with an Interrotron. It's a device where the interviewer sits in a separate room and is filmed, and then your face is projected over the lens so that your subject can look directly into the lens. And I wanted to create conditions similar to FaceTime or Zoom because that was primarily how Paul and I got to know each other. And so I could tell he was uncomfortable and we weren't getting anywhere. And I said, let's take a break. And he came into the room where I was being filmed for the Interrotron. And he said, I don't know how to do this. And I said, just say I'm gay. Just say I am gay. He's like, okay. And he went back and sat down. It was more of the same slippery stuff. And then, I said, Paul, are you gay? And he made a joke. As he should have. It's a ridiculous question in a certain way. And then slowly we started to have a more personal and deeper conversation, particularly about a relationship he had at the end of his time in CalArts. Really the great love of his life, and subsequently his decision at the end of that relationship to go back into the closet. And Paul was really vulnerable when he did that. And, frankly, I was really proud of him. I knew it was hard. And yes, I would honor his wishes to not make this film all about him being gay in any kind of salacious way. But when Paul chose to go back into the closet after the dissolution of this relationship, he did so because he wanted to focus on his career. That was something he could control. Those are his words. And I saw, particularly as a gay person, that Paul kind of compartmentalized into two people. And that the closet is in some ways a metaphor for that. But Paul, in his devotion to work, went on to develop Pee-wee Herman and continued to structure his life in this way where he was his alter ego publicly and he was himself privately.
I knew he was gay, but also knew that he had never been out about it. And I had heard in my life many stories from gay men of his generation. And there are very distinctive ways in which his relationship with his queerness affected his life and art. Like, I think that both he and his sister take pains to talk about how much his parents, including his macho dad, whose macho-ness always affected their relationship, were supportive of him. There's a moment in which AIDS touches his life when he goes to visit his first love, and his first love dies hours later of AIDS-related complications. And that's after the two of them have broken up so that Paul can focus on his career. And these are these distinct traumas that came with being a gay man of his generation, and they're very unusually expressed in his life. And it seems like he really wanted to be clear about the ways in which his relationship to his queerness was not a Hollywood story, was not the 1993 movie version of what being gay in his generation was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Paul wanted to fit into boxes and categories in general. He was really squirrely about that. His relationship to identity did not fit into conventional categories because he was somebody who had committed his life to an alter ego. It's like his relationship to self was different than yours or mine. I don't think it's an issue of being gay or being in the closet, of being Jewish as he was. I think his relationship to identity is different than ours or than most people's. Also, his experience of celebrity is different than others. But yes, I mean, Paul, like many artists and creative people in Hollywood or outside of Hollywood, in Los Angeles, through the 1980s and early 1990s, was impacted by AIDS, but also the culture wars and rise of the conservatism of that era. But Paul was kind of doing his own thing in his own universe that he created. I don't think it's easy to draw parallels between anybody's experience and his, because he designed such an unusual form of identity and was in a lot of ways a world builder living on his own terms.
I don't want to skip over the art. So you're of the age where Pee-wee's Playhouse changed your life. What was special about Pee-wee's Playhouse?
I mean, it sort of depicted a world in which radical acceptance thrives, where you can marry a bowl of fruit salad, where creativity is the primary value system at play, where difference is something to be celebrated, and where art making is the norm.
Hi! While the cartoon was playing, I took an ordinary potato like this and stuck some pencils in it. And I made an animal that looks like this. I was being creative. I used my imagination. You can do this at home, too.
I mean, it's just the world that I wanted to be in. And in a lot of ways, I don't even remember the specifics, but I remember identifying strongly with that world. And most of us who were fans had that pull string doll, this ubiquitous doll that was so popular amongst fans of our generation. And it hung from a hook above my bed for years. And then in a high school photography class, I took a picture of it. And that picture hung on my refrigerator, and it still does. We were talking about identity. My identity felt connected to that show and to that world, not in really specific ways, but almost intuitively.
One of the things that I love most about Pee-wee is what an impetuous jerk he is. And it makes me so happy when he acts like a jerky baby. And that is something that was so unvarnished on Pee-wee's Playhouse for a thing for children with intentions to make them better people, that there's also room for being mad, grumpy, and selfish.
An adult baby.
Yeah. And that felt like a real Paul Reubens thing. Not that he was always grumpy, mad, or selfish, but that he couldn't have made this art without asserting himself in, presumptuous, rude, bratty ways in some contexts.
Yeah. I mean, I relate to it a little differently than just being an adult baby or being tempestuous or difficult. I think of these characteristics both as rebellious, but kind of punk rock. Particularly as I dived into the history of the character of Pee-wee. Pee-wee always felt like kind of like a punk icon to me, probably before I even knew what that was. But he's sort of like a little punk, not just a brat, not just a rebel, but a punk. I think other people have seen that in him. And then when we learn the history of how the character came to be, there's quite a literal connection to that scene.
I want to talk briefly about Paul's arrests, because I'm sure they're on people's minds, especially folks who don't know the full story. He was first arrested after the end of Pee-wee's Playhouse in Florida, where he was from. He was staying with his family in an adult movie theater. You highlight in the film what I think was the most powerful aspect of that arrest, which was the image of Paul as Paul in the worst possible context. How did you bring that up with him?
Well, it's interesting. I never had the opportunity to deeply interview Paul about that arrest and to walk step by step through what happened and how it impacted him. But it's something Paul would bring up regularly, and we did discuss it through the course of our interview. I say that I didn't have the opportunity to because, as I'm sure we'll discuss, our production kind of stopped and was put on the ice for a while. And I was scheduled to do a final interview with Paul the week after he died, in which I was going to discuss his arrests. But luckily, he had discussed them to a certain extent. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I remember most about Paul discussing his arrests is describing the sense of shock he felt. And he really defined shock as a distinct emotional response, different than trauma, different than sadness. But he said he was in a state of shock for years. It gave me perspective. Just like loneliness is different than depression, I think shock is sort of a little different than trauma as we think of it, or albeit with a connection to that. I think it took him a long time to overcome the experience of shock that he felt from just the ruthless backlash that he experienced at that time and the injustice of it all. I think that Paul understood that his arrest was a footnote to his career. People would tell him it's not what I think about when I think about you, but people refer to his arrests when they refer to him. It's there. And that, on just a basic level, was something he wanted to overcome in the documentary. But that was, like I said, the easy part. You know, his arrest was so unfair and a real early symptom of our culture's desire to take down beloved figures, you know, our media kind of fascination with the lurid. You know, Paul was an unfortunate casualty from that early on.
I watched your movie with my daughter, who's 13, and I was kind of pausing it every once in a while to talk to her about something. And watching that portion of the film about his first arrest reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a while, which was my mother's reaction. My mother and I used to watch Pee-wee's Playhouse together. And I was 9 or something like that when he got arrested. And it was in the news everywhere. And I remember my mom saying to me that he was an adult and that was something adults did sometimes. And it was total bull that he was being targeted. And I was feeling this rush of immense gratitude to my mom for taking that position and being so clear with me about it when I was confused. But I also knew that, like, the way that character disappeared from the public was still terrifying and upsetting and confusing to me as a kid. You're a year younger than I am, and I wonder how you experienced it.
I have no memory of it. I never related to Paul through the prism of his arrest, and my memory of Pee-wee was not impacted by his arrest. It just wasn't really on my radar. I may have been aware of it, but I have no recollection of it. And I think there's probably other people like that too, but Paul, I think, really felt that many people saw him and thought of that, which many people do, but people like me didn't. So I didn't really have a strong recollection of feeling there was some sort of injustice surrounding Paul, but I knew that that was a part of his story. It was a part of his story that people wanted to know about. It was a point of concern and sensitivity with Paul, but it never was something that particularly interested me. But I was dedicated to the project of vindicating Paul because looking back, that situation and the consequences of it feels so unfair.
I didn't know that Paul was sick when he died. Very few people did. You and your colleagues didn't, right?
I had no idea. No. I found out that Paul died on Instagram like everybody else. I had had a conversation with Paul about a week before he died, and I could tell something was wrong or off. We were planning to do an interview the week after he died, and we had a sort of meaningful conversation that felt heavy, but I had no reason to believe that he was facing mortality. And I was prepared to proceed with this interview, and I learned that he died. It was, talk about shock, the shock that Paul described. I'd never experienced anything like this. And it took me over an hour to actually read the Instagram post and to learn that he had been privately battling cancer for 6 years, which was just astonishing to me. I had no idea. And it put into context a lot of things that happened through the making of the film. The level of anxiety that Paul felt, some of the fear that I picked up on. There was other stuff going on that I was unaware of. And, the day after Paul died, I really went to work. I started reading the 1,500-page transcript of our 40-hour interview, day in and all night, just seeing things that felt meaningful in the context of his death that I didn't understand before. And I'll be honest, every day from that moment until the completion of the film, I woke up and I thought, you need to rise to the occasion. These circumstances are extraordinary and your responsibility is enormous. Do not drop the ball. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Paul was preparing me for that responsibility. And I hope that I've risen to the occasion because I've been given an enormous privilege to share somebody's personal story, which they had not shared before. And I feel very grateful for that opportunity.
I can tell you this, Matt. I worked on this stupid radio show with Paul for 2.5 years or something like that to make this hour-long radio show that I thought was going to be a week of work. I lost all this money and everything.
It was great. I listened to it. It was great.
It was a total nightmare.
But I know what you did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you went through.
And I had not found a way to express how Paul was in the world, in my narrow experience, or the pain and sadness I had around it, or just my immense gratitude that I had gotten to have that experience. And I saw in your film the Paul that I had seen in working with him in all of the complexity, and felt the gratitude that you had for him and his work. And it really meant a lot to me. So thank you for that, Matt.
Thanks. I'm glad it resonates with you as somebody who collaborated with Paul, albeit briefly. It's intense. It's intense to work with Paul. It's intense to be in his orbit. It's inspiring, and it's also can be combative. And, he was complex, and that's what made him insanely compelling. And I'll never forget the times I've spent with him, even when I was angry or upset or when I was laughing so hard that I lost my voice, or, eating pizza in a car that we bought with petty cash. These memories come rushing back to me. I went through something really intense over the course of years, and I'm still processing that experience, but it was an enormous privilege and a huge responsibility. And I have a lot of gratitude, and I feel proud not just of the film I made, but of what we accomplished together, Paul and I. He was brave. He put himself out there in a way that he didn't necessarily know how to, and he did an amazing job at it. And I'm proud of him for what he accomplished in his life and for his commitment to sharing that with people, because I think it'll mean stuff to people who grew up shaped and informed by the incredible artwork that he put out into the world.
My daughter loved a part of the movie where you asked Paul if, I don't remember, he wanted to be making this movie with you, or if he liked you or trusted you. And Paul said, well, I liked one of your documentaries out of 6. My daughter said I should ask you which one he liked.
I think he liked 2 of my films, but he forgot. No, I had a film come out right before I met Paul called Spaceship Earth, and he didn't like that film. And he told the Safdies and Emma, this is not the right director. And Josh Safdie, to his credit, said, watch Matt's first film, Wild Combination, about the musician Arthur Russell, like another kind of unconventional visionary artist who died of AIDS prematurely in the early 90s and experienced this critical revival. And Paul watched that film and was definitely moved by it and really taken by Arthur and his music. And that moved the needle. I think he took our conversations more seriously after seeing that film. So that was the one that I know got me through the door.
My daughter then said to me, will it make the cut? And I said, I don't know. I don't do the edit, sweetheart. And she said, well, slip the editor a 20.
Yeah, people are like, ooh, ouch, when he says that. It's like, I don't care. Like he's testing me. It's fine.
It was great.
I don't care.
Great. It was amazing. What a line. It was
Yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah.
It was hilarious. Well, Matt, I couldn't be more grateful for your film and the opportunity that it gave me to spend a little more time with Paul, and also to share him with my child and talk to her about her experiences as a queer person in the world and our shared experiences with Pee-wee. So thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you for watching it so closely. I appreciate it.